Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the NCD Alliance webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Should you wish to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Tuesday, January 20th, 2015. And I would now like to turn the conference over to Johanna Ralston, CEO of the World Heart Federation and member of the NCD Alliance Steering Group. Please go ahead.
Hello, welcome to the first NCD Alliance webinar for 2015. I'm Johanna Ralston and I'm with the World Heart Federation and NCD Alliance Steering Group. The focus of today's call will be on the World Health Organization Executive Board meeting, which takes place here in Geneva next week. We'll also focus on the new WHO report, which was launched this week, and the calendar for 2015. And now it is my pleasure to turn over the agenda to Alena Matzke of the NCD Alliance.
Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome from a very, very cold Geneva. Today's webinar is quite short. It's just an hour instead of the usual 1 hour and a half, and we have quite an ambitious set of slides. And I'll start right away with an overview of the 136th WHO Executive Board. It will start on the 26th of January and will run until Tuesday, the 3rd of February. Taking place obviously here in Geneva at WHO headquarters. Ahead of the WHO this year, we'll see a special session on Ebola hosted on Sunday, the 25th of January, and also an information session on process indicators to assess progress on the 2011 UN Political Declaration and the 2014 UN Review and Assessment Outcome Document, and this session will take place on the 24th of January, which is the Saturday ahead of the EB. NCDs, which are covered under Agenda Item 6, are scheduled for the 30th of January, which is the Friday of the first week. And all of the materials can be found on the WHO website, included on the slide at the bottom. Also to note that post-2015 is not directly addressed, or it's actually absent from the agenda. Usually is included under the item on monitoring progress on the MDGs. With this year, it seems to be absent from the agenda. Right. Next slide, please. All right, so on the agenda for NCDs, we have the outcomes of the Second International Conference on Nutrition, an update on the Commission on Ending Childhood Obesity, the follow-up to the UN Review and Assessment on NCDs, which happened in July last year, and then also the draft work plan for the GCM, the Global Coordination Mechanism on NCDs for the period 2016 to 2017. Other related agenda items are item number 5, which is on the WHO reform, particularly interesting the proposed framework for WHO's engagement with non-state actors. Item 7, which is promoting health throughout the life course. And then also item 10, which covers health systems. Next slide, please. Quickly running through the daily timetable for the week. On Monday, the 26th, we have the usual opening, some program reports and communicable diseases on the agenda. Tuesday, the WHO Executive Board will address staffing matters and the WHO reform process. Again, of particular interest here, the framework for engagement with non-state actors. On Wednesday, we'll be discussing the program and the program budget and also preparedness and surveillance. And then on Thursday, launching into health systems and promoting health throughout the life course, including monitoring progress on the MDGs. And finally, on Friday, covering the NCDs, and you can find the timetable through the link included down at the bottom. I'm now going to go into an overview of relevant agenda items, starting with agenda item 6, NCDs. And I'll be starting with a follow-up to the UN review and assessment. So basically, the report, the EB report, provides a summary of the 2014 review and assessment outcome document, including the specific national and global commitments made at the review, and addresses gaps not dealt with by the review, such as a potential set of process indicators to monitor commitments made at the UN level. It also lays out the WHO's role in the follow-up to the review, in particular in technical assistance, such as a series of planned policy briefs on each measure under paragraph 30 of the of the 2014 of the political declaration, which are expected to be published during the first half of 2015. It covers a planned first meeting of NCD focal points in November 2015, and this is a global meeting here at WHO headquarters. And then also the work underway to develop a one WHO NCD work plan. It covers the UN Interagency Task Force for NCDs, in particular a joint UNDP WHO UNDAF guidance note, which is expected to be published in early 2015, very soon, in the 6 joint technical assistance missions that are planned for 2015, building on the first 3 missions carried out in 2014. The Secretariat also aims to publish a first discussion paper in the second quarter of 2015, outlining a proposed approach for a web-based consultation on the development of an approach to register voluntary contributions by non-state actors. And this process will pretty much go on throughout the year, with a final member states meeting at the end of the year. The Global Action Plan Appendix 3 will be reviewed this year, so that a proposed updated Appendix 3 will be submitted to the Executive Board and the WHA in January and May 2016 respectively. And finally, the report also addresses a potential second ministerial conference on healthy lifestyles and NCDs, which could take place in 2016. And the paper can be found in that link at the bottom of the slide, and I'll be addressing the plans or the potential set of process indicators on the next slide. So essentially, as I said, on the Saturday before the Executive Board meeting, there's an information session planned, which will discuss a potential set of process indicators to assess or monitor process on the commitments in the 2011 Political Declaration and the 2014 outcome document. And these discussions were called for by the WHO EMERALD region, with the rationale that we have a framework for accountability at the WHA level. So the WHA monitors progress in implementing the WHO Global Action Plan via the 9 action plan indicators, and also the attainment of the 9 global targets via the 25 outcome indicators of the GMF. What we don't have is an accountability framework for the 2011 UN Political Declaration and the 2014 outcome document. So what we saw in 2013 was a report of the WHO Director General delivered to the UN General Assembly in New York that was based on rather arbitrary indicators taken from the WHO country capacity survey. And so the idea is that for the next report in 2017, which will serve as preparation for the 2018 review and assessment, that we have a much clearer set of indicators to measure process at the national level. And the WHO EMRO region had pushed for the development of such a set of indicators at the review, but no agreement was reached, and so they're now bringing it back onto the agenda after the region itself adopted a set of 17 process indicators to assess country progress across the region by 2018. Next slide. And you can see here a brief overview of these 17 indicators that EMRO adopted in 2014 at the regional committee meeting. It monitors commitments made across the areas of governance, so the implementation of national multi-sectoral plans and strategies, time-bound targets and indicators, the establishment of high-level multi-sectoral NCD commissions, and increased budgetary allocations, and then also commitments across the areas of prevention and risk factor reduction, monitoring and evaluation, and healthcare. And these 17 indicators are reported on a yearly basis, and you can find the full set of indicators at via the link at the bottom. I won't go into detail at this point. You can review this set once we send around the slides or go to this link directly. Next slide, please. So the WHO Executive Board now has the task to assess the need to develop a set of process indicators for all member states, for all regions, decide on if it agrees that there is a need, decide on a process to develop these indicators, and basically the WHO EMRO region provided 3 options to do so. The first one would simply be asking the WHO to publish a technical paper outlining a set of process indicators. The second option would be to task the WHO to develop a technical paper, and then the WHO would note a report on it. Or the third option would be the more extensive and complicated one, which is for WHO to publish a discussion paper and then to convene a formal member state meeting ahead of this year's WHA, and then the WHA would adopt the agreed set of indicators. The EMRO region also suggests that the rest of that the set of process indicators could be basically adapting the 17 process indicators that they themselves adopted. And so the meeting on Saturday, the 24th, will give member states an opportunity to discuss this proposal. We've observed that member states in Geneva are quite apprehensive to reopen discussions and would prefer, and several would prefer to really move into implementation rather than get bogged down by yet another process, especially if it is more complicated. So it's going to be interesting to observe what comes out of this informal session and what the executive board determines. Next slide, please. Right, so moving into a quick update on the global coordination mechanism for NCDs, you may be aware that 2 working groups, that the membership for the 2 GCM working groups has been appointed, including several members of our own network, such as Annalise Ryle with the Norwegian Cancer Society, the Norwegian NCD Alliance, Professor Trevor Hassel from the Healthy Caribbean Coalition, Dr. Mangal Singh from the South African NCD Alliance, and then also Dr. Goma, who's a member of the World Heart Federation, and the likes of Dr. Jane Miranda and Dr. Jean Boxman. These working groups will be co-chaired by member states, which haven't been elected, so we're waiting for those. And the first working group meetings will take place in Geneva on the 18th and 19th and the 23rd and the 24th of February, respectively. There's quite a large selection of background material published on the WHO website, a discussion paper for each of the working groups, basically summarizing a series of policy briefs that are also published on the website, and guiding questions, allowing stakeholders to provide comments on the discussion paper and policy brief by the 6th of February. So if you wish to comment on the papers available, please do so before the 6th of February. Also planned, very interesting in fact, is a dialogue on how to encourage the continued inclusion of NCDs in development cooperation agendas, really looking at the link between the NCD response and poverty reduction. And in the coming days, I believe either tomorrow or the day after, the WHO will publish a call for discussion papers inviting interested parties to submit papers on the link between NCDs and poverty, addressing such questions as which population-based and health service NCD interventions contribute to poverty reduction, and how we ensure that these interventions are delivered in a way that benefits the poor and contributes to poverty reduction. So this call for papers will be open until the 28th of February, followed by a summary paper that the WHO plans to publish in early April, around the 2nd of April, and then the actual dialogue, which takes place on the 20th and the 21st of April here in Geneva. And this dialogue is open for participants of the GCM. Another dialogue on how to strengthen North-South, South-South, and triangular cooperation for NCDs is planned for the 2nd of November. No more details are available at this point. And then, as I mentioned before, there's a global meeting of NCD focal points. So the NCD focal points at the WHO regional offices, as well as the Ministries of Health, which is planned for November this year. More information on working membership and the background material for the working group meetings can be found via the link on the slide. Next slide, please. The WHO report also covers the new work plan for the GCM, which is essentially for the period 2016 to 2017. It covers the work streams along the 5 objectives of the GCM, including proposing 3 new working groups that will be very timely in view of the adoption of the post-2015 agenda. So really looking very concretely as to how to integrate NCDs into existing HIV/AIDS and maternal and child health programs, the alignment of international cooperation on NCDs with national development plans and national health plans, and then also looking at ways to improve health education and health literacy for NCDs. Very interesting as well are 12 region-specific studies that are planned, 2 per WHO region, looking at the national public health burden of NCDs in developing countries and the cost of inaction versus the cost of action. Finally, the report lays out the modalities for the first general meeting of GCM participants, which is planned for 2017. And the EB is now invited to provide guidance on the modalities for a preliminary evaluation of the GCM in 2017 and the modalities of the first general meeting of the GCM in 2017. And from our side, I think we can say that we find that the modalities can be strengthened to really bring out a stronger focus on multi-sectoral action, how to really strengthen the implementation of multi-sectoral plans and facilitate meaningful multi-sectoral engagement and commitment at the meeting itself. Next slide. Moving on to the second International Conference on Nutrition, which took place last year in November. The EB report looks at the WHO's role in the follow-up to the ICN2. It seems that the EB document is slightly outdated, and there's been, in fact, an EB briefing, particularly on the ICN2 that was sent out to member states. But in the paper, the areas that are quite interesting to look at in terms of WHO's technical assistance to member states are that WHO plans to produce guidance to cover the different policy areas in the framework for action that is accompanying the Rome Declaration, the main outcome document of the ICN2. It will look at how to review regulatory instruments to promote healthy diets, review effective interventions on childhood overweight, and develop a series of policy papers to provide a rationale for the recommended policies of the framework for action to support its member states in the implementation of the framework for action. It addresses accountability for the commitments made at the ICN2, and I believe they're quite weak in the sense that the commitments are made at the ICN2 were obviously voluntary, and so the WHO will now work with member states on establishing nutrition targets at the national level and integrating these targets into existing monitoring frameworks at the national level. In the absence, however, of clear indicators for how to monitor progress on the ICN2 commitments, it sort of remains to be seen how WHO will really monitor progress on the commitments made at the ICN2. So far, obviously, WHO is monitoring the WHA nutrition targets and the NCD targets, but that only covers a very small aspect of the commitments made at the ICN2. We know that the WHO is planning to provide more detail on the planned decade for action, which is needed for endorsement of the ICN2 outcome document at the UN General Assembly. So in September of this year, the UN General Assembly will be asked to endorse the ICN2 outcome document and also to declare a decade for action. On post-2015, the policy, the report, the EB report, remains quite weak as well. Right now, it's not clear how the ICN2 commitment to integrate the ICN2 vision and Rome Declaration into the post-2015 development agenda, how this will actually happen, and it would have been interesting to see more guidance from WHO on how to achieve such integration. Finally, it also can be remarked that the EB report remains silent on the issue of governance, and the FAO had in December in the FAO Council report made a proposal for the Committee on World Food Security to be the preferred mechanism for ICN2 follow-up, but so far we haven't really seen any positioning from the WHO side on governance for the follow-up for the ICN2. So the actions by the executive board are to provide guidance on the tasks of the Secretariat as laid out in the report, recommend to the 68th World Health Assembly to endorse the ICN2 documents and also to decide on the period on reporting. The report suggests reporting every 2 years, and then also to urge or appeal to member states to start implementing the actions outlined in the framework for action. Next slide. Another agenda item under NCDs is the WHO Commission on Ending Childhood Obesity, which was established at the World Health Assembly in May 2014. The aim of the Commission is to deliver a comprehensive strategy applicable to different regional and socio-economic contexts by the end of this year. The Commission is supported by 2 working groups working on science and evidence and monitoring and accountability. And so far, the Commission has twice. The last meeting was just concluded last week here in Geneva, and additional hearings and consultations planned for 2015 are for the European region in April 2015, for the WIPO region between March and April, and in the EMER region again early 2015. And I don't have any details on those meetings. The Secretariat is also working on an interim report with outlining specific interventions of high impact applicable across all WHO regions, and this interim report will go online for public consultation in March. The EB report and the ECHO website are included at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. Very quickly, before handing over to my colleague Rebecca, who will talk about the WHO reform, agenda item 7.4 on women and health and the celebration of the Beijing Declaration, 20 years of the Beijing Declaration. The report is in so far interesting for NCDs as it lays out emerging priorities for improving women's health and the elaboration of the post-2015 agenda, and specifically mentions the importance of NCDs for women's health. In particular, explaining that women are differently affected by NCD risk factors than men, and that in providing figures for female premature deaths from NCDs in low and middle income countries, and providing details on women in tobacco use, harmful use of alcohol, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, low traffic injuries, cancer, mental disorders, and aging. The Executive Board is now requested to give further guidance on WHO's leadership in addressing these challenges and emerging priorities. I'm quite pleased to see that NCDs have received particular attention in this report. I will now hand over to Rebecca, who will guide you through the WHO reform agenda items.
Thanks, Alena. So what I want to do is just cover a couple of highlights from this latest iteration of the WHO framework on engagement with non-state actors, or NSAs, and identify some of the strengths and weaknesses, particularly from an NCDA perspective. And just to finish up by looking at one other key area of the WHO reform process that may also have a significant impact on our advocacy work, which is a review of the methods of work of the WHO governing bodies. So to start with the framework of engagement, this current draft that is to be presented to the Executive Board provides a summary of some of the key issues that were raised by member states at the World Health Assembly last year and presents a revised framework based on those comments. The Executive Board is asked to provide guidance on this framework that will then be submitted to the World Health Assembly in May. So the first issue then is of course around conflict of interest, which has perhaps been one of the most contentious issues and taken up a lot of the discussion time, there were calls from several member states for a much stronger approach or policy around conflict of interest. And the Secretariat has responded to that by adding an additional section on the management of so-called institutional conflicts of interest and also other risks of engagement, including provisions on how those conflicts of interest would be managed through due diligence, risk assessment, and also significantly by giving member states a strengthened role in oversight as well. The second area is around applying private sector policies to non-private sector entities. So again, a couple of member states expressed concern that some non-private sector entities may be subject to the influence of the private sector, and that NGOs or academia that are considered not to be at arm's length, in inverted commas, from the private sector should actually be considered as private sector entities themselves, and they should therefore be subject to the specific policies that apply to private sector organisations. And according to the framework, WHO would determine whether or not that happens through its own process of due diligence, and based on that decide whether or not a non-state actor is subject to the influence of private sector, and whether therefore it should be considered as such in the way that it engages with the WHO. So then the third area is around secondments. So there was a key concern here around the need to protect the independence and the integrity of the WHO, and some member states proposed excluding any secondments from private sector entities. Others proposed not allowing secondments from any non-state actor at all, and that's the view that's been reflected in the final document. So there is a clear point to say that WHO should not accept secondments from any non-state actor at all. The fourth area then is around boundaries and entities with which the WHO will not engage. So member states felt that the restriction on working with the tobacco and arms industries should be extended to include others such as the alcohol and food and beverage industries. But the framework doesn't go that far, but simply says that WHO should exercise caution when engaging with other industries that affect health. And then finally, one of the other issues that was raised by several member states back in May was the need to have an evaluation function embedded in this framework in order to allow for regular review by both the World Health Assembly and the Executive Board, and to provide an opportunity to identify any problems with the framework, to pull out any lessons learnt, and so that could inform future iterations of the framework. And that evaluation process has now been reflected in this new draft document. Next slide, please. So then some of the strengths and weaknesses of this new draft is that firstly, around flexibility, it really gives the WHO that much needed flexibility to take a truly multi-sectoral approach, particularly for NCDs, and also to be able to have engagement with both NGOs, academia and private sector across the spectrum of its work. At the same time, the framework is much clearer than it has been in the past about what WHO perceives to be a conflict of interest and how they should be assessed and managed. There's also a much stronger emphasis on due diligence, and as I mentioned, with a larger role for member states to play, but also an emphasis on transparency, including through a new register for non-state actors, which is publicly available online and is something that NCDA had really pushed for throughout this reform process as a really important tool for monitoring and management of the engagement of WHO with non-state actors. The other thing is that this new framework does imply, if you read between the lines, a lot more work for the Secretariat and certainly for the Member States in conducting their due diligence and risk management more systematically. It also, by nature, then implies a change in status for some organisations and also the nature of their engagement with WHO. So I think the process of monitoring and evaluating the efficacy of this new framework and approach is key. It shouldn't become such a cumbersome process that it stops other work being done. And then looking at some of the weaknesses as well, there are a couple of missed opportunities in this document, and one of them is the fact that WHO is under-resourced, and particularly in the NCD space, where there is still one of the largest funding gaps across WHO programs, and non-state actors, including a lot of us on this call, do have a wealth of expertise and experience that could effectively be leveraged by the WHO through secondments. So a clear no to taking that off the table altogether, I think is a missed opportunity, and perhaps something that we as NCDA may want to think about pushing back on, and at least having more dialogue with member states next week to see what the position is on that and why that decision was taken. Secondly, the framework, it could have been an opportunity for member states to take a much stronger position around the engagement of WHO with other industries that affect health, such as alcohol, food and beverage, which in this case in the paper has sort of been avoided with a note to caution, but it could have been an opportunity perhaps to take a stronger position, and maybe is something that we may also want to consider taking up. And finally, I think an area of concern that may be shared by the NCDA network as a whole is that some non-governmental organisations may be feeling that if the process of due diligence is not fully and fairly undertaken, then they may be inappropriately labelled as a private sector entity, and therefore in some cases either unable to continue engagement or have to move to a different type of engagement. And at the moment, this paper isn't that clear on what those criteria exactly will be. So I think that's something that we would hope to get more clarity on in the discussions next week as well. And next slide, please. So another key area of the WHO reform process, which, as I said, does have some implications for our advocacy efforts, is the review of the work of the governing bodies. So there are a couple of proposals on the table to improve the methods of work. The first is to promote more manageable agendas by more rigorously applying the criteria for agenda items, which means that each time we may not be able to cover everything, and that some things may be taken off the table to be covered in smaller groups rather than needing to go to the EB or the WHA. Another proposal is to establish a web page for member state and observer statements, so that during the sessions themselves there would just be a short statement from each member state, and then a longer version would be available online. The other big issue is side events. So last year it seems that there were over 60 side events at the World Health Assembly across 5 days, and a lot of delegations, many of whom have very small delegations of just 1, 2 or 3 people who just can't possibly cover all of the events and are feeling overstretched and that there's just not enough focus. So some of the proposals to manage that situation are to hold a one-day session in advance of the World Health Assembly for side events. Another is to pass on the cost of organising side events, including the room and technical support, which I imagine they think will again reduce the number of those who are applying to hold them. And finally, to introduce a limit on the number of side events, for example, to just 2 per day or 2 per region across the week. So it'll be interesting for us to see how those discussions go next week especially because any decisions that are taken next week by the Executive Board could already be implemented and be in effect for the May World Health Assembly this year. So that has quite an immediate implication for us and our planning for our events in May as well. And that I'll hand back to Alena. Thanks.
All right, I will conclude the EB segment of this webinar by bringing to your attention an important international conference planned for March. In responding to initiatives on dementia at the G7 level, the World Health Organization has announced that it will be holding the first Ministerial Conference on Global Action Against Dementia at WHO headquarters on the 16th and 17th of March this year. The aim is to increase awareness of dementia as a serious public health challenge and to connect the existing WHO, NCD, and mental health streams of work, and also in general to improve the understanding of government's role and responsibility in responding to the challenge that dementia poses. The main aim is to discuss how to build a global roadmap to support national efforts on dementia, and we really encourage you in your dealings with government delegations to promote high-level, i.e. at the ministerial level, participation in the conference. On that note, moving to the very last slide on the Executive Board, summarizing key advocacy messages for the upcoming Executive Board. We very much invite you in your interactions with the Member State and WHO contacts before and during the Executive Board to encourage the development of a set of process indicators so that we will see a very strong Director General's report in 2017 feeding into the 2018 review assessment containing clear insights on the progress achieved in implementing the 2011 and 2014 declarations. We really encourage you to impressing onto Member States the need for active and strong engagement of participants in the global coordination mechanism, as well as concrete action-oriented outcomes of the GCM working groups, and also perhaps a short note here on the modalities of working group meetings. It would be very useful for these meetings opened up to experts outside of the GCM working membership with concrete expertise not covered by the working group. This is not included. There's in the GCM terms of reference, there's a small paragraph that allows for such opening, and would be good to impress that or remind Member States of that possibility. Finally, we strongly urge the Executive Board to recommend the endorsement of the ICN2 outcome documents and to provide concrete guidance to the WHO Secretariat as to how to move forward work towards the integration of ICN2 commitments into the post-20 development goals. Also, especially because it's absent from the agenda, reminding Member States a strong focus on health in post-2015, including the target to reduce premature mortality from NCD by 1/3 by 2030, and the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control as a means of implementation. And as I just said, promoting high-level participation at the WHO Global Conference on Action Against Dementia March. All of our detailed two-page brief on the NCD Alliance's advocacy EDs are uploaded to the website, included on the link at the bottom of the page, and we also include a very short the side events taking place during the ED week, including an event on the first ever Global Nutrition Report that is taking place on Wednesday, the 28th of February at the Graduate Institute here in Geneva. And you can find all of that information that day. That note, I'll send over the Global Status Report on NCD.
So thank you, Alena, and thank you very much, Rebecca. Again, this is Johanna Ralston with NCD Alliance Steering Group and World Heart Federation. Thanks for those excellent presentations. I think we have a few minutes for questions and answers, and there were a few questions, so we'll address those now. On the technical side, I think we are working to have everybody speak more clearly and loudly, but there are some issues with phones. We do apologize for that, but thank you for your comments, and I think the operators have been helpful as well. There is a number you can redial if that has worked for some of the participants. But again, please, we all do need to speak slowly and clearly. Also, slides, as always, will be available shortly after the call. So those will be sent out to all participants, so you'll be able to keep those and reference back. And then there's two content-specific questions, which I will direct to Alena, Rebecca, and Katie. The first is around the selection of organizations to participate in the Global Coordination Mechanism. What is the information or criteria for that? The second is when will the process indicators be discussed and decided? Is it within the document, the EB document, and could there be clarification on that? So on the first one, the question is actually expand what information is available about selection of organizations to participate, non-state organizations, to participate in Global Coordination Mechanism. It may be useful here. I think it's a mix of organizations and individuals. NCDA and all of us were heavily involved in this. But perhaps Katie or Alena or Rebecca might have a response to that in terms of criteria and information available on the selection process.
I mean, this is a kind of a difficult question to answer without knowing the specific focus of the question, but we know now that there have been more than 100 applications for GCM membership, and membership or participants can come from private sector, they can come from NGOs and other stakeholders, including UN agencies. We know that different organizations across our network have had, some organizations were accepted as participants very quickly and without further request for additional documentation, whereas others have been requested additional information such as on the financials of the organization, and this is obviously because of the limitations that WHO has at this point on its engagement with non-state actors. If an organization wants to apply, it can do that via the website. It's relatively straightforward, and then WHO will get back to the organization with either the acceptance or request for additional information.
Okay. So can there be clarification in terms of the process indicators? At what point will they be discussed during the agenda?
So, Ivona, the process indicators will be discussed twice. So there's this information session on Saturday, the 24th, which is, as the name says, it's informing member states on the proposal of the WHO EMERA region, and it provides a forum for discussion. And then the EB itself on Friday, the 30th of January, will take up questions and take a decision at that point.
And is there any country that proposes a decision? Is that right?
It's the WHO region that has proposed that the executive board discuss.
No, I know, but has any country, a specific country, is Ivona's question? Aside, EMRO proposes the process indicators, but is there any country that proposes a decision that needs to be supported?
Well, there's an information note which you can follow on the link, via the link that's put it on the slide on process indicators, and that information note through the whole process in terms of the options that WHO or the executive board can decide on, and also a proposed set of indicators. But apart from that, I'm not aware of any draft decision out there yet.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now we will move over to Katie Dain, NCD Alliance Executive Director, who will update this group on the WHO Global Status Report on NCDs, which was launched just yesterday here in Geneva, and it was an excellent event. Katie?
Thanks, Johanna, and hi everybody. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the WHO Global Status Report that, as Johanna said, was launched yesterday. So as many of you will know, this is the second Global Status Report on NCDs. The first one was published in 2011, and it was a kind of key feed-in report to the UN high-level meeting on NCDs in 2011. This second one takes quite a different focus. So the first one was very much kind of providing the evidence base on the NCD burden. This one focuses much more on guidance towards attaining the 9 global NCD targets and 25 indicators. So it's quite a different type of document. It's less about the evidence and it's more about providing guidance and useful practical recommendations for governments at the national level. But having said it focuses less on the evidence, it obviously provides the most current estimates on NCD mortality from 2012. And also, obviously, on the risk factors as well in all of the 194 countries. It was launched yesterday at a side event at WHO headquarters in Geneva. The side event was kind of a closed meeting for WHO representatives and missions from Geneva. Included in the speakers were WHO Director General Margaret Chan, Oleg Chesnov, the ADG for NCDs. There were 5 or 6 ambassadors that spoke and gave reactions to the report, and there are a number of civil society speakers as well, including myself for NCD Alliance and UNDP and a couple of others. I think it was very promising to see so many people in the room, so many governments particularly, and also hopefully, as many of you are aware, the event was webcast, and so you were able to kind of listen in if you weren't able to be in Geneva. Next slide, please. So in terms of the objectives of the Global Status Report, the objectives are to provide, as I say, much more about guidance to set national targets in alignment with the global NCD targets. And I think the reason why this report is so timely is that obviously at the UN high-level review in July last year in New York, all governments agreed to set national NCD targets by 2015, a national NCD plan, and establish a national NCD commission in their country. So what we're saying is that this is actually very similar to the 3-1 principle of the HIV/AIDS movement: one plan, one set of targets, and one multi-sectoral mechanism. So what the status report is meant to be doing is trying to inform governments of how they should go about setting their national targets. It also has an objective to implement or to support governments to implement a set of priority interventions, very much drawing upon the WHO best buys, and also obviously to report on progress made in attaining these targets so far. But on that last point, I think it's important to highlight that WHO currently doesn't have the mandate to report on progress at the country level towards the targets, because the targets are essentially global. They're voluntary and they're global. So what the report does is it provides a snapshot at the global level of how we're doing towards those 9 targets and 25 indicators. And one of the key messages that comes out of the report is that we're not doing nearly enough. Next slide, please. So as I said, the whole report is framed around these 9 targets. Each target has its own separate chapter. And a lot of the report goes into how well we're doing towards each of those targets at the global level. I think one of the shortcomings of this report obviously links back to what I just said. I think the difficulty with this report is that even though it provides a good global snapshot, as a country, it's actually you can't really tell how you're doing compared to other countries, and this is where I think we need to go much more into the future, actually trying to analyse country by country how countries are doing towards their own national targets, and understanding a lot more about what's working and what's not working. Next slide, please. So just as an example, the report provides evidence very useful for our advocacy efforts. including, for example, this slide where it talks about the proportion of global NCD deaths under the age of 70, i.e. premature mortality. I'm not going to go into detail on these slides, but just to say that there are some very useful figures in the report and up-to-date statistics. But we know that every year 30 million NCD deaths. Out of those 38 million, 42% are premature, which is what this 16 million is out of all those deaths which are premature, which is obviously a big advocacy point for NCDs in making the case. Next slide, please. It also includes some interesting figures like these spider diagrams around the probability of dying from a major NCD prematurely. The report says that globally in 2012, a 30-year-old had a 19% chance of dying from one of the four main NCDs before their 70th birthday. So that's globally. But we obviously know that the probability varies greatly by region. So what you can see here is that in many high-income countries, the probability decreases to around 10%, versus where in low middle-income countries it goes up to around 30% your probability of dying prematurely. So just to flag the fact that this report has a number of very useful statistics and figures that we can all be using in our advocacy. It also, as I said, includes a very strong focus on the priority interventions for attaining the targets. So this is really around the kind of guidance to governments. What they do is very much draw from Appendix 3 in the Global NCD Action Plan, which you'll remember was quite controversial. It's meant to be a kind of menu of policy options. And they very much relate those interventions to how you can achieve the targets, the 9 targets and 25 indicators. Next slide, please. So in summary, what the report does is it outlines a number of very important key messages. Number one, NCDs act as a key barrier to poverty alleviation and sustainable development, which is obviously very important for our advocacy in these final stages of the post-2015 development agenda. Number two, to move from political commitment to action, high-impact, affordable interventions need to be prioritised and implemented, obviously with a focus there at the national level and to governments. Number three, all countries need to set national NCD targets and be accountable for attaining them. So that links back to the 2014 commitments made by all governments to develop national NCD targets. And my own personal add-on to that one would be that it's not just about the targets, but it's about the national NCD plans and the mechanisms, the multi-sectoral mechanisms that need to be established at the country level, which links very nicely into number 4, which is around structures and processes for multi-sectoral and intersectoral collaboration need to be established. So that's really essentially the kind of glue by which we're actually catalysing sectoral cooperation for NCDs. Number 5, investment in health systems is critical for improving NCD outcomes, so the health system strengthening agenda. And then finally, institutional and human resource capacities and financial resources for the NCD prevention and control require strengthening. And I think that's one of the reasons why the GCM's new working group on financing for NCDs is so important, because we've all been saying for a very long time that sustainable financing for NCDs is extremely inadequate and weak. But now we have this opportunity with the GCM working group on financing to really put some very concrete and action-oriented recommendations on the table, whether we're talking about domestic resources, bilateral development resources or philanthropic resources. We obviously need to find some more sustainable solutions, particularly as we progress towards getting NCDs into the post-2015 development agenda. So I'll finish there just by saying that I really urge you to link, have a look at the link and the report. There's also a press release that you can find on that same page that WHO issued, and it is a very important report for advocacy, and it provides a lot of very useful data for all of us. So thank you, and back to you, Johanna.
Thank you very much, Katie. Any questions? Why don't we just jump to the next one, which is just quickly calendar of events in 2015, and then we can see if there are any questions related to both of those. Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, so this we just wanted to finish to give you just a very quick overview of the main events that are happening in 2015. At the last webinar, we alluded to the NCD Alliance's priorities for this year, but this slide just gives you a kind of quick snapshot of the big global events that are happening, which we're going to be linking into this year. First and foremost, in January we have the Executive Board, which obviously Alena and Rebecca walked you through just now, which is happening next week in Geneva. Following that, in March, and I should say that you should be focusing at the moment at the top of the calendar, not at the bottom, in March we have the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, in New York. And the reason why that one's particularly important this year is that it's actually marking the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action, which happened in 1995. So it's an important opportunity from an advocacy perspective to be promoting NCDs as a priority for women's health. In May we have the Commonwealth Health Ministers meeting, which always happens just before the World Health Assembly, so on that Sunday. This year it will obviously be a good opportunity to be promoting the importance of NCDs as a post-2015 development priority, because May will be very much at the kind of closing point of the post-2015 development agenda. So getting those 54 Commonwealth Health Ministers in one room is a good opportunity from our side. Obviously the World Health Assembly happens the next week, and we expect there to be a strong focus on NCDs, likely to be picking up a number of the items that are discussed at the EB, like the process indicators, and obviously again WHO, always a good opportunity to promoting the post-2015 priorities. In June, there is a process at the moment going on which is being led by the World Bank, WHO and USAID on measurement and accountability for health. This is currently focusing on the indicators for health in post-2015. And as well, the other priority for this kind of conference is around how you can actually harmonise the way that we measure and monitor health a lot better, because obviously at the moment there's a number of different institutions that measure progress on health, and there's a number of different ways that we measure progress on health. And so this is an effort to try and harmonise and bring them together and make it more coherent. In July, there will be the third international conference on financing for development. This is happening in Ethiopia in July, and there's a huge process going on in New York at the moment around this in the lead up to that conference. This will be important because it really will focus on how we are going to finance the post-2015 development agenda. Obviously, there's a big push at the moment from lots of bilateral development agencies, particularly of trying to shift the conversation around financing for development beyond just thinking about aid, thinking a lot more about domestic resource mobilisation and innovative financing mechanisms. So from our perspective, this again will be a very important point. And I think a lot of the outcomes from the GCM financing working group could feed into that conference as well. Moving on to September, we have obviously the UN High-Level Summit on post-2015, which is happening 25th and 27th of September in New York, when the actual post-2015 agenda will be adopted. So again, big priority for us. And then near the end of the year, in November, the NCD Alliance will be convening our first Global NCD Alliance Forum, which we announced last September. And that forum is very much for national and regional NCD alliances. There's now over 30 alliances out there, and so it's going to be a capacity building workshop for those alliances. And then at the end of the year, there is the big conference of the parties on the UN framework on climate change. So again, opportunities to be integrating health and NCD messaging into the broader environmental agenda. At the bottom of the slide, I won't go into any detail, but that outlines the post-2015 intergovernmental negotiation process. So in addition to these global events that we will be focusing on to get NCDs visible and heard, obviously we will also be focusing very much on those post-2015 intergovernmentals, which have started this week and continue through to July. So as you can see, it's going to be a very, very busy year for NCDs and global health. But there's a lot of opportunities and lots of entry points as well, which is the great thing. So I'll end there and pass back to Johanna.
Thanks so much, Katie. And as she mentioned, it is a very, very busy and important year for our efforts. Lots going on and lots of opportunities for engagement. One question was around the date for the forum. Isn't that it's around the 13th? Is that right, Katie? The likely date for the Global NCD Forum?
Yeah,
the 13th of November?
We're still confirming it, but at the moment we have tentatively the 13th to the 15th of November. But we'll be confirming that in the next couple of weeks, and obviously we'll share that with our network as soon as we have it confirmed.
Excellent. Again, the slides will all be sent out shortly after this call ends, and thank you to everybody for your participation. There are still a number of questions. Also, one other question that had come up was around the availability of the WHO status report, which is, again, on their website. I think that's indicated in the slides, but it is an excellent report. We're very pleased with it, and it is on the website. So again, thank you very much for joining today's call, the first NCD Alliance webinar for 2015, and it promises to be as busy and important a year as have been the past few years. So thanks very much. For additional information, please do visit the website, and we will send out slides shortly. Thanks very much, everybody.